Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we set our boots down on the hard, frosted stones of a medieval castle, where the bitter wind claws at the ramparts and every breath curls into the air like smoke. The subject? Toilets. Yes, of all the grand stories of knights, ladies, kings and banquets, it's the cold, draughty, utterly human need to relieve yourself in the dead of winter that really brings the medieval world alive. You picture yourself in some glorious chamber hung with banners, but when your stomach rumbles at night and your bladder nags, reality shoves aside romance. This is not the part of history illuminated in stained glass. This is the gritty, icy underside. And trust me, you probably won't survive this nightly journey to the garderobe without a few shivers running straight down your spine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love it if you posted in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there right now. Midnight in London, dawn in Manila, or maybe somewhere in between. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice stepping into this castle world is the cold. It's not the polite sort of winter chill that modern heating can chase away. No, it's the invasive, bone-deep cold that turns water into brittle shards and makes iron kiss your skin like frostbite. You shuffle down corridors lined with tapestries meant to keep out drafts, but the stone walls bleed cold as though they're part of the weather itself. Your breath puffs in front of you, misting as though the castle itself sighs. Every corridor groans, not with ghosts tonight, but with the endless settling of ancient beams contracting in the freeze. Imagine you're one of the inhabitants, a page perhaps scurrying about with tasks, or even a visiting noble trying to keep dignity intact while bundled in layers of wool and fur. The great hall is warm only while the fires rage, but the moment you step away the air nips at your face, and sooner or later nature calls. Your bowels don't check the season, your bladder doesn't consult the weather. In this age of stone and ice you have no choice but to venture toward medieval sanitation. The word itself, garderobe, hints at something deceptively gentle. In French it suggests a wardrobe or a closet, a place to store garments, and indeed, garments were sometimes hung in these little rooms, because people believed the pungent ammonia rising from waste would keep moths away. But here in winter, you're less worried about moth holes, and more about frostbite in places too delicate to mention. You walk with dread down narrow passages to that tiny chamber perched above the moat, or dangling precariously on the outer wall. The draught hits you before you open the door, a sharp reminder that your body's about to be exposed to the elements in a way that feels almost cruel. It's no secret that medieval castles were built for defence, not comfort. Heating was secondary, sanitation was even lower on the list. Yet necessity demanded a solution, so garderobes were cut into the stone, little niches with wooden seats and shafts that carried waste straight down to the moat, or to a cesspit lurking below. During mild seasons you might tolerate the smell, shrug at the buzzing flies, and get on with your day. But in winter, the whole ordeal shifts into a surreal struggle. The stone under your thighs is icy, the wood rim stiff as frozen bark. You lower yourself down gingerly, feeling both vulnerable and absurd, your rear end hovering over a dark chute, where the air rushing upward feels like a mountain gale trapped in a funnel. That chilling wind is no exaggeration. Historical records note how drafts through garderobes were notorious, enough to make them dreaded spots. The open shafts acted like chimneys, channeling not only smells but the cruelest winds upward. You imagine yourself bracing your hands on either side, teeth gritted, muttering through chapped lips. This had better be quick. Even kings wrapped in furs could not escape that sting. Privilege bought cushions and attendants with torches, yes, but not immunity from nature's icy slap. You might think, well, at least the waste froze quickly, locking in the smell. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The cold did help, especially when temperatures plummeted hard enough to freeze the moat solid. But half-frozen excrement was no joke. It clung, hardened in grotesque forms along the stone and had to be scraped away later. And since maintenance was usually left to servants already suffering frostbitten fingers, the job was done irregularly. Imagine the sighs, the curses muttered into scarves, as night soil workers chipped at waste as though carving unwanted sculptures. That's the sort of art history no gallery preserves, What makes this even more fascinating is how normal it was. You step into this story with modern sensibilities, appalled at the lack of heated bathrooms, horrified by the thought of exposure. But to them, this was life. Daily, nightly, unending. You learned to deal with discomfort. You developed habits, timing your needs, using chamber pots to avoid late-night walks through icy corridors, clutching cloaks around yourself like armour. Some even placed warmed stones near their bedding, little makeshift heaters, to stave off the bitter chill long enough to make the dash less excruciating. And yet, amid all this hardship, medieval folk found odd comforts. Remember the dual-purpose idea of hanging clothes in garderobes? That wasn't a joke. It was a genuine belief that the strong ammonia from waste deterred pests. So in winter, your tunics might smell faintly of the privy, but at least they weren't riddled with moth holes. Scholars today still debate whether that practice actually worked, or whether it was superstition dressed as practicality. But it tells you something profound. What was foul to you might have been useful to them. Picture the social spectrum. A noble has attendants to light torches, to bring perfumed herbs, to carry portable chamber pots back to servants for emptying. The lower ranks, they have to march through the freezing air alone, clutching their garments against the draught. The sensory divide is sharp, but in the end, the call of nature levelled everyone. Whether your backside rested on velvet cushions or raw planks, the wind showed no mercy. And here's a quirky twist. Some castles designed garderobes side by side, communal in nature. Not only do you shiver on the seat, but you might be doing so next to your fellow castle dweller, eyes politely averted, trying to carry on small talk while both of you pretend this isn't happening. If that doesn't humble your image of medieval grandeur, nothing will. It's one thing to attend a feast in glittering hall, another to sit shoulder to shoulder in a draughty stone cubicle, hearing every splash echo down into the frozen moat. Historians still puzzle over just how effective these sanitation systems were. Were castles riddled with disease because of poor waste management, or did the sheer cold help suppress bacteria during winter months? Some argue that frozen conditions actually minimise certain risks, while others suggest the thaw brought disasters, when months of accumulated waste melted into reeking floods. That debate remains alive in scholarly circles, leaving you to imagine the uncertainty from your own seat in this time machine. And as you sit here, bundled in imagination, picture the sensory assault, the biting cold, the faint torchlight, the smell of smoke from the hall clinging to your cloak, the sharp odour rising from below. Every detail is a reminder that you are alive, in a place where survival was constant negotiation, and comfort, especially toilet comfort, was never guaranteed. This is where your story begins tonight, perched on the edge of history, literally and figuratively. You shuffle forward in the story, leaving the relative safety of your bedchamber behind. The flickering rushlight in your hand sputters as the winter draught toys with the flame, reminding you of what lies ahead. Somewhere down the corridor, tucked in a stone recess, is the castle's garderobe, the official word for what we'd simply call a toilet, only this one is less porcelain comfort and more icy endurance test. You feel each step echo through the silent corridors, the cold creeping up through your shoes, while outside the wind howls across the battlements. The castle walls are thick, but not thick enough to keep out the season. The garderobe is a peculiar architectural feature. It juts out from the outer wall, a vertical shaft that drops straight down into the moat or into a cesspit. In summer, it smells. In spring, it floods. But in winter, it breathes cold. The shaft works like a wind tunnel, drawing freezing air upward with astonishing force. You've heard people joke that sitting on the garderobe in January is like perching above the mouth of an angry dragon who prefers to breathe glaciers instead of fire. And tonight, you're about to confirm that description. You push open the wooden door. No latch worth mentioning, just a rough board fitted into stone. Immediately your torch flutters and your face stiffens against the blast. It's like someone has shoved your head into a sack of snow. The flame nearly dies before settling into a fragile dance, and you step inside, clutching your cloak tight around your body. The air is sharp, bitter, and merciless. The wooden seat, a plain plank with a circular hole, looms ahead of you like an execution block. You know what's coming, but you still hesitate. There's no insulation, no clever engineering to soften the blow. The shaft plunges downward, and through it you hear the eerie whistle of wind cutting through stone. Sometimes it moans, sometimes it shrieks, depending on how the gale strikes the walls outside. Tonight, it howls with a voice so raw it makes your skin prickle. The cold funnels upward and finds every gap in your clothing. You're still fully dressed, and yet your knees are already trembling. You brace yourself, muttering encouragement. Nobles and peasants alike endure this. Alike. Even the king must grit his teeth when the urge comes. You lower yourself toward the wooden seat, and instantly your skin reacts. The chill bites through fabric, through flesh, as if you've touched ice itself. For a second, your body wants to recoil, to say, not today. But biology doesn't negotiate with weather, so you sit, half wincing, half laughing at the absurdity. The drafts are relentless. They swirl around your ankles, creep up your thighs, sting your belly. You find yourself hunched forward, cloak pulled over your knees like a fortress, trying to trap whatever warmth you can. The sound of the wind roars louder through the chute beneath you, and for a fleeting moment you swear it feels alive, like a spirit reaching up from the darkness. Medieval folk weren't strangers to that idea. Stories circulated of evil lurking in latrines, spirits waiting in shafts to seize the unwary. It sounds ridiculous in the comfort of modern plumbing, but here, right now, with icy air clawing at your skin, you can almost believe it. And the smell? Strangely muted tonight. The cold deadens it somewhat, freezing the worst fumes before they rise, but not entirely. The shaft still carries the pungent reminder of countless visits before yours. That faint, sour tang snakes upward, mixes with the bitter wind, and makes you wrinkle your nose. You can't decide which is worse, the stench or the sensation of being flayed by invisible ice knives. Mainstream accounts of castle architecture confirm this reality. Guardrobes were among the draftiest places imaginable. Engineers of the time simply cut a hole and let gravity do the work. The idea of trapping warmth or sealing the shaft wasn't considered practical. In fact, airflow was sometimes welcome, since it helped sweep away the smell. But in January, that ventilation felt like punishment. Servants knew it. Nobles knew it. Chroniclers even wrote with a kind of grim humour about these icy inconveniences. And here's an odd little tidbit to lighten the gloom. Some garderobes had multiple holes side by side, so 2 or 3 people could, in theory, sit together. Imagine that camaraderie in winter, the wind whistling, everyone pretending it wasn't awkward. Archaeologists have uncovered such designs, debating whether they were for efficiency, for communal use in emergencies, or simply for lack of space. Either way, the thought of huddling with a neighbour in this icy draft makes you chuckle. Misery loves company, but maybe not that much company. Scholars still wrangle over whether people in medieval castles preferred using garderobes in winter at all, or whether they relied almost entirely on chamber pots when temperatures dropped. Chamber pots offered privacy and spared the draught. Though they created another chore, someone had to empty them, usually at dawn, into the same freezing shafts or cesspits. Some argue that the wind tunnel effect was so notorious that chamber pots were the real winter standard, with garderobes reserved for emergencies or daytime use. The truth may be somewhere in between. After all, humans are practical creatures. When a room feels like the North Pole has moved in, you adapt. You huddle there, trying to distract yourself. The stone walls sweat with condensation, where warmer indoor air meets the freezing shaft. Ice crystals lace the edges of the wood. You think of the masons who carved this recess centuries ago, probably more concerned with defending the castle than with your current comfort. You can't help smirking at the irony. They built walls 20 feet thick to stop an army, but a simple draft has conquered you utterly. A small joke crosses your mind. The seat feels like a training ground for knights. Forget jousting. If you can sit through this ordeal without crying, you're ready for battle. Your teeth chatter, your toes twitch in your boots, and you remind yourself that countless people endured this exact misery, night after night. No central heating, no warm toilet paper, no flush handle to whisk things away. Just wind, wood, and willpower. You finish as quickly as you can, rising with relief not just of the bladder but of escape. Your thighs feel half numb. Your cloak whips about you as you step away from the seat. The torch struggles again, as if eager to be gone from this place. You push the door closed, not that it stops the draft, and exhale with something like triumph. You've survived another journey into the coldest corner of the castle. The thought lingers. This is only one trip. one moment. For the people who lived here, this was life repeated daily, nightly, unending. They normalised it. Children grew up with it. Lords grumbled but endured it. And the cold wind through the garderobe became just another quirk of existence, woven into the tapestry of castle life. You, however, will not forget it so easily. The memory clings like frost to your bones, a reminder that history is less about shining armour and more about the very human struggle to stay warm on a winter's night. You retreat from that icy garderobe, teeth still clattering from the wind, and stagger back toward your chamber. The torch hisses softly, its light shrinking as the corridor bends. You think about how many times people risk that ordeal in the middle of the night, in darkness, in half-sleep when the urge struck. The thought alone makes you shudder. Not everyone dared. In fact, for many castle dwellers, whether nobles under thick blankets or servants curled near the kitchen embers, the safer choice during freezing winters was the chamber pot. Now picture it clearly. You slip back into your room, rushlight guttering on the table, and there it is, waiting under the bed like a loyal but smelly dog. A squat ceramic pot, maybe glazed if you're wealthy, or a rough wooden bucket if you're not. Sometimes they're metal, brass if you're lucky, tin or iron if you're practical. The pot is never glamorous, but it is indispensable. The moment your bladder gives its midnight order, you reach down, tug it out from beneath the straw mattress and sigh with relief that you don't have to trek through icy corridors. The straw mattress crackles as you shift, the smell of dried rushes mingling with the faint tang of old use. Because let's be honest, chamber pots were emptied when convenient, not every single time. Servants collected them in the morning, sometimes later if the weather was brutal. You can imagine the sound of pots being stacked, the slosh, the muttered complaints of sleepy workers carrying their frosty cargo through the halls. The convenience of the chamber pot was obvious. Children used them. The elderly depended on them. Guests in chilly guest chambers probably praised them as miracles. But in winter, they became nearly universal. The idea of exposing yourself to the freezing shaft seemed masochistic when a pot offered relief only a stretch away. The stone floor was icy under bare feet, so keeping a vessel close at hand was simply sensible. And here's a little sensory detail to make you wince. In winter, the contents often steamed. Picture that thin mist rising from the pot in the morning, the ghostly vapour drifting like a phantom across the chamber. The warmth of the body colliding with the bite of cold air created an unholy fog, proof that the night had not passed without bodily needs. If you've ever seen breath fog in the cold, you can imagine the same for a chamber pot, except far less poetic. Mainstream accounts describe chamber pots as essential across medieval Europe. In castles, townhouses, even monasteries, they were universal. What varied was how often they were emptied and who had the job. In noble households, the lowliest servants drew the short straw. In some places, night soil collectors even came into towns to remove waste, carting it off for disposal or for use as fertiliser in fields. You don't envy them their work, least of all in January, when every splash felt like a threat of frostbite. And then there's a peculiar tidbit. Some pots were elaborately decorated. Archaeologists have found chamber pots with little painted scenes, jokes or moral lessons inside. Imagine lifting the lid to see a cheeky drawing grinning back at you. Humour, perhaps, was one way to make an unpleasant necessity tolerable. One surviving pot has a face painted at the bottom, so the user literally relieved themselves on a smirk. That sort of medieval wit might raise your eyebrow, but it shows they weren't entirely without playfulness. Historians still argue whether chamber pots were mostly for nighttime emergencies, or if they became the mainstay of castle sanitation during the worst winters. Some scholars suggest the guardrobes were practically abandoned when the temperature dropped too low, while others point to written records where lords complained of icy draughts yet still demanded guardrobe cleaning. The truth is likely a messy overlap. Some nights the pot sufficed, other nights the shaft was unavoidable, and sometimes both ended up overflowing before the thaw. As you lie back in your bed in imagination, the pot tucked discreetly under your straw tick, you realise how much trust you put in its reliability. A sturdy handle so it won't tip, a wide mouth to avoid disaster in the dark, a lid if you're lucky enough to have one. Some were carved with simple wooden covers, others had cloth thrown over them to blunt the smell. You can almost hear the complaints of a sleepy noble pulling aside the covers. Ugh, fetch herbs, this chamber reeks. Servants might scatter dried lavender or mint to soften the stench, but herbs only did so much. The sound of a chamber pot being dragged from under the bed is familiar too. A scrape, a shuffle, a faint clink. You imagine a dozen such sounds across the castle in the still of night, overlapping like a secret symphony of necessity. The walls carry whispers, but the pots carry proof. Morning comes, and the procession begins. Servants carrying pots down stone steps, across courtyards glazed with frost, dumping them into pits or over walls, where the cold air seizes the waste and holds it in ghastly suspension. One curious anecdote survives from medieval chronicles. Some noble families kept their chamber pots lined with straw or ash, which helped absorb liquid and cut down on smell. It's a clever trick, the kind of low-tech hack you can almost admire. You imagine tossing a handful of ash into the pot after each use, a little gesture of courtesy both to yourself and to the poor soul who empties it. And it shows that medieval people were resourceful. They didn't just suffer, they adapted. But adaptation had limits. You know the feeling of waking half asleep, fumbling in darkness, and reaching for a pot that you pray is where you left it. One slip of the hand, one clumsy footstep, and disaster spills across the floor. The rushes underfoot soak it up, and suddenly the chamber smells worse than any garderobe draught. Some chronicles hint at this too. Maids scolded for accidents, apprentices punished for sloppy cleaning. You can imagine the scowls, the whispered curses, the resigned laughter, when someone's misstep made the whole hall reek for a day. And don't forget, chamber pots weren't confined to bedrooms. During feasts, nobles sometimes had attendants bring pots discreetly to them behind screens, sparing them the embarrassment of leaving the table. Picture yourself at a roaring banquet, fire blazing, minstrels playing, and behind a tapestry someone squatting over a pot, hoping nobody notices the faint sound or smell. It's a detail history books usually skim past, but one that reminds you of the unvarnished human side of grandeur. You, however, are tucked in bed now, your pot safely under the straw. The wind claws at the shutters, the fire dwindles in the hearth, and you pull the woolen blankets close. You're grateful, in your imagination, that you don't have to expose yourself to the howling draught of the garderobe tonight. Instead, your relief is close at hand, though you'll pay the price in the morning when the servant wrinkles their nose and mutters under their breath while hauling it away. So as you drift towards sleep, you reflect. This is medieval luxury, this pot under your bed. It's not porcelain, not flushable, not fragrant, but it is survival. In a world where stone walls hold in the cold like a prison, and garderobes howl like icy tunnels, the humble chamber pot is your ally. And though you'd never want to use one in your modern home, here, now, in this castle winter, you wouldn't trade it for the fanciest cushion or the richest feast. You'd trade almost anything for the simple warmth of staying under your blankets while answering the most basic call of nature. You wake to the sound of clattering buckets, the shuffle of boots on stone, and the faint curses of servants whose morning chore is both thankless and grotesque. The chamber pot under your straw mattress has done its duty, but now it must be emptied. You lift your head from the pillow, feel the chill bite instantly at your nose, and realise what those poor souls are about to face. Because in winter, the castle's sanitation doesn't just stink, it freezes. And frozen waste, as you're about to discover, creates dilemmas so strange you almost laugh before gagging. You picture the shaft of the garderobe, that vertical chute that drops to the moat or cesspit. In summer it flows however foully toward the water, in spring it overflows with thaw, but in the depths of January it clogs. The excrement piles, hardens and shapes itself into what can only be called medieval ice sculptures, accidental grotesques formed of filth and frost. Imagine a stalagmite rising from the frozen moat below, growing with each contribution from above a dirty icicle of human life. It sounds absurd, but chroniclers and archaeologists alike have remarked on the strange layers preserved by cold. The servant who approaches this spectacle in the morning must chip at it with a shovel or a pole, his breath fogging, his hands numb inside thin gloves. He thrusts the pole down the shaft, wincing at the scraping sound, and sometimes the whole frozen mass groans as it shifts. A chunk might break free and crash into the moat with a sickening thud, shattering like rotten ice. You imagine his relief each time it gives way, until he realises he'll be back tomorrow to repeat the same unpleasant ritual. Mainstream historical fact reminds us that cesspits were a common feature of castles, often dug deep into the ground or beneath the walls. In summer they festered, but in winter they transformed into frozen vaults, locking away the waste until the thaw released it all at once. That cycle shaped daily labour. Servants didn't always bother clearing fully in January, knowing that the thaw would handle it eventually. But sometimes, when the build-up threatened to block the shaft, they had no choice but to intervene, swinging tools like miners carving through unwanted ore. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. In a few recorded cases, frozen waste was so solid that it was repurposed, temporarily, as footing across icy moats or as a disgusting kind of filler material. The idea of walking across a bridge made partly of frozen sewage is enough to make you double-check your boots. Was it hygienic? Absolutely not. Was it practical in a pinch? Apparently yes. People in the past were resourceful in ways that you may not wish to emulate. Scholars still debate just how bad the sanitation crisis became in winter. Some argue that the freezing actually slowed the spread of disease, preserving waste in a state that minimised bacteria until spring. Others suggest that the thaw created catastrophic floods of filth, spreading illness more effectively than a single summer cesspit could. The arguments hinge on archaeological layers, written complaints, and the study of soil chemistry, but the truth likely lies somewhere in between. For you, standing in your imagination on the icy ramparts, what matters is that the problem was unavoidable. Frozen waste wasn't just a nuisance, it was a danger waiting for the season to change. Now, imagine yourself as a servant. Dawn hasn't even properly broken. You haul a bucket outside, boots crunching on snow, your fingers stiff. You approach the moat, and there it is. The ice crusted over, but dark shapes trapped within, half-frozen waste like insects caught in amber. You tip your bucket and the contents sit stubbornly on the ice before finally sliding, a slow brown smear across the frosted surface. You grimace, but you're used to it. You've seen worse. You've smelled worse. You've carried out this routine so many times it barely registers, until you slip on the ice, nearly spilling the bucket over yourself. Your muttered curses join those of countless workers across centuries. Castle sanitation was a daily grind, and winter only made it crueler. Imagine the calluses on those hands, the stoic patience of people scraping frozen filth from stone, the quiet endurance that kept the castle functioning. Without them, life inside would grind to a halt, buried under layers of waste and snow alike. And think too of the nobles. They don't see this morning labour, not directly. They rise, stretch, sip hot spiced wine, and complain about the draught in the hall. Their chamber pots vanish as if by magic, replaced by fresh ones lined with gash. They don't know or don't care about the spectacle outside, the frozen moat carrying a cargo of the entire household's digestion. And yet they're not immune to its consequences. When the thaw comes, when the walls drip and the moat stirs, they'll smell it first, their silk sleeves perfumed with a reminder of months of denial. One joke, whispered among servants, was that a winter guardrobe seat prepared you for purgatory. You sat above the darkness, cold searing you, waiting for release. It was grim humour, but it kept spirits alive, and maybe it's not too different from the jokes we make today about office bathrooms or portable toilets at festivals. Humanity has always softened disgust with laughter. As the day passes in your story, the frozen dilemma doesn't vanish. Waste piles grow slowly in the shafts, icicles of filth forming where drops froze mid-drip. The air inside the guardrobe smells faintly sweeter, oddly enough, because the cold masks the worst of it. But that's only a temporary mercy. The build-up remains, waiting. The servants will chip again tomorrow, and again the next day, and eventually the problem will solve itself in the ugliest possible way, with the thaw. You walk back into the hall, your imagination heavy with what you've seen. The frozen moat glimmers in the weak sunlight, its surface deceptive, hiding its gruesome underbelly. The castle bustles with life. Pages run errands, guards stamp their feet to keep warm, cooks stoke fires for the midday meal. But beneath it all, literally beneath their feet, the waste dilemma grows, frozen into grotesque monuments to daily necessity. The grandeur of stone and banners cannot hide it. History is not polished marble. It is ice crusted over filth, waiting for time to crack it open. So tonight, as you picture yourself lying back under your wool blankets, be grateful for modern plumbing. Because in this castle winter, even the most ordinary relief came with extraordinary problems. You may have survived the draft of the guardrobe, and you may have clutched your chamber pot close, but you cannot escape the frozen dilemmas piling outside. The season has claimed even waste itself, and the castle waits nervously for the day it all melts. You step outside in your mind's eye, boots crunching over a courtyard rimmed with frost, and approach the outer edge of the castle. Below you, stretching like a defensive necklace, lies the moat. In storybooks, moats are shimmering bands of water, maybe with swans gliding across, or at least glacial reflections of the stone towers above. But in winter, when the wind bites and ice lattices across the surface, the moat becomes something far less romantic. It is quite simply the castle's toilet bowl. Every garderobe shaft, every chamber pot emptied over a parapet sends its cargo tumbling down into that water. The moat is not just defence, it is disposal, and when the freeze arrives, that disposal becomes both a blessing and a curse. From the parapet you peer down. The surface of the moat glistens with a crust of ice. In some places it's thick and strong enough to support a man's weight. In others, thin plates ripple and crack with the slightest toss of a stone. Beneath that ice lurks months of accumulation, human waste, kitchen refuse, animal remains, and whatever else the castle discards. In summer, it stinks, a swampy stew that makes your stomach churn. In winter, the cold quiets the smell but traps the contents like a monstrous time capsule. Every trip to the guardrobe or every bucket emptied from the kitchens becomes another offering to this frozen cauldron. The idea sounds shocking to modern ears, but mainstream historical accounts are clear. Moats were frequently used as sewage receptacles. It made sense from a defensive standpoint. Why dig cesspits inside the walls when the moat was right there, circling the castle like a ready-made ditch? Waste disposal and defence combined into one feature. But practical as it was, you can imagine the soldiers wrinkling their noses as they patrolled above, the stink rising in summer, and in winter the eerie silence as filth froze mid-flow. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes the moat doubled as a food source. Fish thrived in moats, and hungry inhabitants might drop lines in. The problem? Those fish fed on exactly what you don't want to think about. Chroniclers even mention jokes about moat carp tasting peculiar. You can almost hear the banter at dinner. "Would you like more of the pike, my lord?" Best not to ask where it's been, whether everyone avoided moat fish or not. The association was enough to make it the butt of humour in the Middle Ages. Still, historians continue to debate just how filthy moat water really was during freezing winters. Did the cold purify it somewhat, locking bacteria into ice? Or did the gradual build-up mean that once thaw arrived, the moat became a catastrophic flood of pathogens? Some scholars argue that winter moats acted like temporary refrigerators, halting decay, while others insist that the very first warm day unleashed plagues of stench and sickness. That question lingers in research, but standing here above the ice, you don't need academic consensus to know the smell of spring will be terrible. You lean against the parapet, watching servants shuffle forward with buckets, the clank of iron, the grunt of effort, and then the splash as they tip waste onto the frozen surface. Sometimes it slides down the slope of ice, skating to a stop. Sometimes it clings, steaming faintly before frosting over. The servants shrug, turn back and head inside. It's routine to them, unremarkable, though you're gagging in sympathy. For them, this moat isn't a picturesque boundary, it's the dumping ground, the one place in the castle where all roads lead eventually. Imagine being a soldier on watch at night, patrolling the wall above that moat. The torches burn low, your breath puffs in the air, and below you the ice creaks. It isn't just natural cracking, it's the slow shifting of frozen waste, settling under its own grotesque weight. You hear groans, faint pops, and perhaps the sudden crash of a piece breaking loose. Somewhere in the dark, the moat rearranges itself like some living thing. You grip your spear tighter, not because you fear invaders, but because you can't shake the image of being swallowed if the ice gave way beneath you. The defensive value of the moat wasn't lessened by its foulness. In fact, it was enhanced. Imagine attackers wading into that water, armour clanking, only to realise they're waist-deep in sewage. In winter, the ice might tempt them to rush across, but the castle defenders could hack at the surface, breaking it beneath them, plunging them into the frigid, fetid broth. There are accounts, half anecdote, half legend, of armies driven back not by arrows but by disgust. the smell of the moat making them gag before the battle even started. You chuckle at the thought. History isn't always won by swords. Sometimes it's won by the toilet. The reality, though, is grim. Servants who had to work near the moat hated the job, clearing debris from the water, hacking holes in the ice to dump buckets, even fishing out the occasional lost object. These were punishments in themselves. Some castles assigned whole crews to moat maintenance, a task as miserable as it sounds. They trudged out with poles, breaking ice, shifting refuse, their noses red, their clothes stiff with frost. You can imagine the jokes they traded, the gallows humour about being lords of the moat, inside the castle, nobles liked to pretend the moat's purpose was entirely military. They spoke of defence, of the water glinting under moonlight, of how invaders would find no easy footing. They rarely acknowledged that their own waste lay beneath the surface. But at night, when the wind shifted and carried the smell faintly across the courtyard, there was no denying it. A castle was a fortress, yes, but also a giant latrine with towers. One small, almost comic detail. Sometimes guardraobes were built directly above the moat so that the waste fell straight in with a splash. Now, imagine in winter, the moat frozen over, the waste drops, smacks the ice, and sits there in plain sight until someone scrapes it away. If you're a servant hauling a torch, you can see a whole gallery of offerings scattered across the ice like obscene decorations. You try not to laugh, because laughter makes the cold sting your lungs, but you also know this is life here. As the day goes on, you find yourself glancing again and again at that moat. It reflects the sky like a mirror, but you know the truth. Beneath the sheen of ice is a hidden world of rot, preserved until spring. Children playing in the courtyard may not think of it. Guests arriving may marvel at the towers rising above. But you, having peered into the reality, know that the moat is more than a defence. It's a frozen cesspit, the castle's open secret. And tonight, as you crawl back under your woolen blankets, the wind howling outside, you remember the sound of buckets clattering, the sight of waste skating across the frozen surface, and the eerie creak of ice shifting under its unholy burden. If you ever dreamed of living in a castle, this detail might make you rethink it. Because the moat, for all its grandeur in pictures, was really the castle's bathroom, icy, stinking, and unforgettable. You drift deeper into the castle's routine, slipping into the footsteps of those who carried the heaviest burdens, literally. The noble lord might grumble about drafts and frozen guardrobe seats, but it was the servants, the lowly and often nameless workers, who bore the brunt of the winter toilet crisis. They were the ones who rose before dawn, when the air was so cold it seemed to bite the inside of your nose, and trudged from chamber to chamber, collecting chamber pots and carrying night soil to its grim destination. You can almost hear them before you see them. The clatter of ceramic lids, the scrape of wood against stone, the heavy footfalls muffled by straw strewn across the floors. The sound isn't cheerful. It's the weary music of necessity. Each pot is hauled from beneath a bed, or handed over by a bleary-eyed page, or dragged reluctantly from under a lord's fur-draped couch. And with each one comes the same ritual. A quick mutter, a wrinkle of the nose, and a shuffle to the corridor where the procession begins. Picture the line of servants in the pre-dawn gloom. Each one balances 2 or 3 pots by their handles, sloshing with a sound no one mistakes. They carry them down narrow staircases, careful not to slip on frost or step into spilled rushes. Their breath steams in the cold, but the pots steam too, little plumes rising from the contents inside. The smell thickens in the air, sharper than smoke, impossible to ignore. This is the hidden labour of the castle, the work no minstrel sings about, no chronicle praises, yet without it the entire fortress would drown in its own waste. Mainstream history records this practice bluntly. Gong farmers in towns and night soil men in castles were essential, low-status workers. In rural estates, peasants carried out waste as part of their duties, sometimes dumping it on middens or spreading it in fields as fertiliser. But inside a castle, with its packed walls and high towers, the job fell to household servants. They didn't choose it. It was assigned. Often the youngest, weakest, or least favoured took the role. Their reward? A few coins more, perhaps, but mostly disdain and ridicule from others. And here's a peculiar little tidbit. Some servants tried to sweeten the chore by humming songs, the same melody repeated day after day, until the tune itself became associated with the smell. Imagine a castle boy trudging down steps, humming a half-forgotten ballad, while every listener wrinkles their nose and mutters, "Ah, the waste collectors are about." Music as deodorant, it didn't work, but it kept morale from sinking completely. Historians still puzzle over whether these servants were allowed any protective clothing. Some sources hint at gloves of rough leather, others at layers of straw stuffed into boots for warmth and absorption. There's even debate over whether cloths were tied around their faces, both against the cold and the stench. Some argue this was common sense, others think it unlikely given the cost of materials. The evidence is unclear. What's certain is that those workers faced frostbitten fingers, shoes soaked in slop, and endless mockery from their peers. Now follow one of them as he pushes through a door and out into the courtyard. The wind slams him instantly, freezing the sweat on his brow. His arms ache with the weight of pots. The handles dig into his palms. He stumbles toward the moat's edge or the cesspit dug nearby, the ground slick with frost. One wrong step and disaster would spill across the cobbles. He braces, sets the pots down and tips one carefully. The contents splash onto the ice below, joining the grotesque gallery already forming there. He grimaces, wipes his nose on his sleeve, and mutters a prayer that spring will come quickly, or at least that his stomach doesn't turn before he finishes the round. There's a strange dignity in his persistence. Nobody thanks him. Nobody praises him in songs or feasts. But without his work, the great hall would reek, the noble chambers would choke with stench, and disease would spread faster than rumours at court. You might say he's the most vital worker of all, though the most invisible. The castle's survival depends on soldiers with swords, yes, but also on servants with chamber pots. And imagine the hazards. Winter meant icy steps, frozen handles, slippery boots. More than one unlucky servant surely fell, contents spilling across his tunic or the flagstones. Laughter might follow if others saw, but it was bitter laughter, tinged with pity. The smell clung for days, even after scrubbing. You can almost feel the humiliation. A young boy mocked in the kitchens, no one wanting to sit near him, his nickname forever linked to the accident. In a world where honour mattered, what worse fate than being branded the soiled one? Yet not all was misery. Servants developed tricks, ash sprinkled in pots to cut the odour, warm stones placed near handles so fingers wouldn't freeze instantly, quick shortcuts through lesser-used passages to avoid noble eyes. Some even bartered. A page might offer to carry another's load for an extra scrap of bread or a favour owed. You see the small economy of survival growing in the shadows of grand halls. The nobles, of course, barely thought about it. They might ring a bell, grunt a command, and expect the pot to vanish. To them the waste disappeared as if by magic. The truth trudging across the courtyard in the freezing dark was invisible, but you, watching, cannot ignore it. You see the bent backs, the shaking hands, the resigned faces of those who shouldered the filth of an entire castle. One small joke circulated among castle folk. A lord's crown shines brightest, but his servant's bucket is heavier. You chuckle softly, knowing there's more wisdom in that quip than in most sermons. Titles and banners mean little when your stomach churns and you need relief. In the end, someone else carries it away. As the morning brightens, the procession ends. The servants set down their empty pots, stack them neatly, and warm their hands by the kitchen fire. They don't speak much of their chore. It's too routine, too unglamorous. But the castle is fresher, the chambers aired, and the great hall smells of bread and broth instead of last night's wine and this morning's waste. Their work has made the fortress livable again, at least for another day. You retreat in your imagination, wrapping your cloak tighter, thinking of the weight of those buckets and the endless cycle they represent. It isn't glory, it isn't heroism, but it is survival. And in a winter castle, where every draught and frozen moat reminds you of discomfort, perhaps survival is the truest kind of nobility. You've trudged along with the servants, smelled the chamber pots steaming in the dark, and peered into the frozen moat. Now your imagination shifts upward, to the private chambers of the lord or lady of this castle. If you thought privilege spared them the humiliation of winter toilet ordeals, you'd be only half right. Because yes, the nobles enjoyed certain luxuries, but the draught, the cold, and the reality of waste didn't care for crowns or titles. Even royalty had to sit, and yet their backsides did so on cushions, behind draperies, and sometimes in chambers that were carefully designed to soften the blow. You walk down a quieter corridor now, guided by the faint glow of wall torches and the rich scent of herbs burning in braziers. This is the Lord's private space. Here, tapestries line the walls not just for decoration, but for warmth. The door to the guardrobe is heavier, bound with iron, and when you step through you realise this isn't the bare stone recess you saw before. It's lined with wood, smoothed and polished, perhaps even carved with a modest pattern. The seat is wider, the edges cushioned with cloth or even padded with wool. Instead of sitting on a raw plank, the Lord rests on something closer to a chair. Functional, yes, but softened with a touch of dignity. Mainstream fact: many castles included privy chambers attached to the Lord's rooms. These were guardrobes with slightly more care, built with access from bedchambers so that nobles didn't have to trudge across courtyards at night. Sometimes they had small windows for ventilation, sometimes they were lined with wood to make the space less frigid, and occasionally seats were covered with cloth or fur for comfort. These additions didn't erase the draught, but they made the experience less brutal than what the servants endured. And here's a curious little tidbit. In a few notable castles, archaeologists have discovered garderobes with traces of fine fabric fibres embedded in the layers of waste below. How did those fibres get there? Possibly from nobles using bits of cloth instead of rough moss or hay for wiping. Imagine the extravagance. Fine linen sacrificed in the name of comfort, even if it ended up tumbling down the shaft into the moat. For the wealthy, even relief had its luxuries. Historians still puzzle over whether such comforts were common or rare. Were padded seats a widespread noble indulgence, or just the privilege of a few kings and queens in wealthier courts? Some argue that most nobles endured only slightly better conditions than their servants, while others point to archaeological finds suggesting specialised guardrobes with elaborate design. The truth, as with most medieval matters, probably varied by wealth, by region, and by the eccentricities of whoever ruled. Now, imagine the scene. The Lord rises from his bed at dawn, fur cloak thrown across his shoulders, attendants hovering nearby with torches and cloths. He shuffles into his guardrobe, sits with a grimace, and issues commands even as the icy draught assaults him. Perhaps he's dictating orders for the day, or complaining about a rival noble, while clutching the edge of a cushioned seat. Privacy, after all, wasn't always guaranteed. Attendants sometimes stood close enough to hear, their duty to fetch water, herbs, or cloths as needed. You smirk at the thought. Royal dignity balanced precariously over a shaft of filth while someone waits nearby with lavender bundles. The chamber itself tries to soften the ordeal. Incense smoulders faintly, perfuming the air with frankincense or rosemary. Wooden panels creak as the wind rattles through the shaft, but the padding of tapestries dulls it slightly. The Lord rests his feet on a rug instead of frozen stone, and maybe even leans against the wall as if in thought. Compared to the bare stone hole used by servants, this is almost luxury. Almost. Think of how the medieval imagination blurred necessity and symbolism. To sit on a cushioned throne in the hall was power. To sit on a cushioned seat in the guardrobe was, well, not power, but perhaps a reminder that even in the most human of acts, nobility insisted on being distinguished. You can imagine the craftsman tasked with shaping that seat, sanding it smooth, ensuring it didn't splinter the posterior of someone who wore a crown. That kind of detail mattered, if only because a splintered backside might sour a mood for days. One small joke would not be out of place here. Picture the noble boasting, "My throne is velvet," and some snide servant whispering, "Aye, but we know which throne you use most often." Humour, after all, was as essential to survival as warmth. But these comforts didn't change the fundamental fact. Nobles, too, sat in the cold. The draught was no respecter of persons. Cushions might dull the bite of the wood, incense might mask the worst odours, but the icy wind still crept upward, numbing skin and reminding everyone, dukes and dairymaids alike, that they were mortal. The castle wall carried no mercy. The moat froze for all. Waste piled up the same way, whether it fell from a king's chamber or a servant's, and yet you can't help but marvel at the effort put into maintaining appearances. Nobles expected their guardrobes to be kept fresh, their cloths to be plentiful, their herbs renewed. Servants scrambled to oblige, scurrying in and out to replace ash, to hang new sprigs of lavender, to scrub the wood with vinegar. All so that their lord might feel, if only for a moment, that even relieving himself was an act befitting dignity. As you linger in this noble garderobe, you sense the paradox of medieval comfort. Wealth could soften life, but it couldn't conquer nature. Fireplaces roared, yet draughts still prowled. Beds were draped in velvet, yet backs ached in the cold. Toilets could be cushioned, yet they still opened onto a shaft of ice and filth. Luxury in this world was relative, and perhaps that's why nobility clung so fiercely to their trappings, because deep down they knew the draught cared not for titles. So as you leave the chamber, cloak pulled tight, you carry the image of that cushioned seat with you, a symbol of medieval reality, a mix of grandeur and grime, dignity and discomfort, a throne of necessity, softened but never truly transformed, and in that contrast lies the truth of castle life, that even the highest backside in the land met the same icy gust that whistled up from the moat below. You leave behind the cushioned noble seat, still feeling the ghost of cold draughts in your imagination, and step into the hazy air of a chamber where something unexpected greets you. Not stench, but fragrance. In a world where waste is constant and the moat carries the castle's secrets beneath a frozen lid, you might be surprised to find that medieval people fought back against foulness with every tool they had, and their favourite weapons were perfumes, herbs and smoke. The garderobe, whether humble or royal, was rarely without some form of scent-masking charm. You picture sprigs of dried lavender hanging from hooks on the wall, their purple faded but their perfume still sharp. Bundles of rosemary and thyme tied with twine dangle above the wooden seat, swaying in the draught as though they were alive. In more affluent castles, small censers of incense are left smouldering, filling the air with thick resinous smoke. Frankincense, myrrh or juniper if supplies allow. The aim is obvious: cover up the smell of human waste. But in winter, when the cold preserves odours differently, the effort takes on an almost desperate note. Mainstream history confirms this habit. Inventories of castles and manors often include herbs listed specifically for their use in garderobes and chambers. Lavender, mint, sage and chamomile were all favourites, easy to dry and hang, long-lasting in scent. Some households even scattered petals across rushes on the floor, hoping their fragrance would rise as the straw was trodden underfoot. It's one of those everyday practices that rarely makes it into romantic retellings of medieval life. But once you notice it, you see how essential it was. And here's a quirky tidbit to amuse you. Archaeologists have uncovered ceramic balls and little clay jars once filled with perfumes or resins, left deliberately in garderobes. They were, in essence, medieval air fresheners. Some even had perforated lids, designed so that the scent could seep out slowly over time. Imagine sitting in a freezing stone cubicle, clutching your cloak and sniffing at a clay pot of rose oil placed nearby like a polite guest. It didn't erase the smell of the shaft below, but it dulled the edge, gave you something else to focus on while the wind nipped your skin. Scholars still debate whether these perfumes and herbs were more about hygiene or superstition. Some argue the goal was purely practical: mask the smell, keep moths from eating stored clothes, drive out fleas and vermin. Others suggest there was a spiritual dimension, that certain herbs were believed to repel demons or disease-bearing spirits lurking in foul air. In a time when miasma theory, that bad smells carried sickness, dominated thought, burning incense wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. And so, the garderobe became both a toilet and a battleground against invisible dangers. Step into one now in your imagination. The torchlight glows weakly, but a censer swings from a hook in the corner, smoke curling upward like ghostly fingers. The air is thick, spiced, almost choking with frankincense. The wooden seat gleams with polish, and next to it lies a small basket filled with dried lavender bundles. You reach out, pick one up, and crush it gently in your hand. The scent bursts forth, fresh even in the freezing gloom, and for a moment it does transport you, away from the shaft below, into a meadow of summer sunlight. Then the draught gusts and reality rushes back. Even in private chambers, nobles often ordered servants to refresh the herbs daily. Pages scurried with baskets of dried sprigs, sprinkling them like confetti into corners, stuffing them between cracks in the wooden seat. Ash, too, was scattered into pots not just for absorption but for smell. Vinegar was splashed against the walls occasionally, the sharp sting of it cutting through the air like a cleansing blade. You can almost hear the slap of a rag soaked in vinegar as a maid wipes down a surface, muttering about how the odour lingers. Meanwhile, in less wealthy corners of the castle, people improvised. A peasant girl might tie a scrap of cloth around her neck, soaked in rosemary water, so she could breathe through it while tending pots. A servant might carry a sprig of mint between his lips, chewing at it to mask the stench. Some even carried little pomanders, small wooden or metal balls pierced with holes, stuffed with herbs or resin. These dangled from belts or hung around necks, making every step to the guardrobe a little more bearable. And of course perfumes weren't confined to toilets. The entire castle smelled of them in winter. Fires struggled to keep up with damp air, meat roasted constantly, and rushes on the floor absorbed everything spilled upon them. To fight back, herbs were everywhere, burned in halls, placed in windows, tucked into mattresses, but in the garderobe they took on a heightened significance, because that was where the castle's fragility was laid bare. Behind the walls of grandeur you still had to sit in the draught, exposed to the same human needs as everyone else. The herbs were little reminders that even in humility you could try to claim dignity. Here's a joke you can't resist. Imagine a noble striding proudly from his chamber, trailing the scent of lavender and frankincense, only for the servants to whisper, "Ah, his grace smells freshly from the garderobe again." Scents didn't always conceal, they betrayed too. You linger in this fragrant chamber, inhaling the mix of sweet herbs and acrid draughts, and you think about how human the detail is. Everyone wanted relief, but everyone also wanted comfort. And in an age without plumbing or antiseptics, perfume and plants were the closest thing to magic. The castle walls might groan under winter winds, the moat might creak with frozen filth, but here in this tiny room someone once crushed lavender and believed, if only for a moment, that they had made the world gentler. So as you leave, the sprig still clutched in your hand, you realise that the battle against smell was as constant as the battle against the cold. Herbs, perfumes, incense, all were small shields in a daily war against discomfort. And though they never truly conquered the stench, they did what all medieval people had to do. They tried, they endured, and they carried on. You shuffle back into the main chambers, away from the scented bundles of lavender and rosemary, and immediately notice something underfoot. The floor crackles faintly with each step, not because of ice, but because of rushes, bundles of straw, reeds, or hay spread across the flagstones. In summer they soften the ground, absorb spills, and give the illusion of warmth. But in winter, those same rushes become stiff, damp, and sometimes half frozen, especially in the guardrobes and adjoining chambers. You glance down and realise the floor itself is another battlefield in this endless war against the cold and the consequences of waste. Picture the great hall. The lords and ladies dine under high timbered ceilings, a roaring fire casting flickers across tapestries. Beneath the trestle tables servants have scattered fresh rushes, often mixed with herbs like mint or marjoram. For a moment it looks cosy, almost rustic, but walk across them in January and your boots crunch, because moisture seeps from the stone beneath, freezes overnight and stiffens the straw into brittle mats. In corners near guardrobes or chamber pots, the problem is worse. Waste sometimes splashes or spills, soaking into the rushes. The frost then seizes those damp patches, hardening them into strange little frozen crusts. Mainstream history confirms that rushes were used throughout medieval Europe, replaced periodically when they became too filthy. Records even mention kings issuing orders for fresh strewing herbs to be laid in halls before feasts. The idea was both practical and decorative, but the reality? Rushes collected everything. Grease from spilled stew, wine from overturned cups, ash from fireplaces, hair from dogs or cats, and yes, urine or worse from chamber pots tipped too hastily. In winter, nothing dried quickly. Moisture clung and froze, so the floor became a patchwork of ice-flecked straw, pungent in smell and unpleasant to touch. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some rushes were so neglected that they became semi-permanent layers, compressed into floors several inches thick. Archaeologists excavating medieval houses have found strata of old rushes, piled one atop the other like geological layers of daily life. Imagine living above months of half-frozen debris, each step crunching over not just straw but forgotten scraps of food, fish bones and tiny bones of rats that once crept through. The thought makes you wrinkle your nose even before the draft of the guardrobe does. Historians still disagree about how often rushes were changed. Did castles really refresh them monthly, as some records suggest? Or did servants simply sprinkle new herbs and straw on top of old, leaving layers to rot beneath? Some argue that nobles demanded frequent replacement, while others suggest the evidence points to long-neglected flaws that would horrify modern sensibilities. The truth may lie between ceremonial spaces refreshed for appearances, private or servant areas left to accumulate. Imagine yourself now padding toward the garderobe at night. The rushes under your feet are stiff with frost. A faint crunch accompanies each step, echoing in the silence. You feel the chill rising from the stone beneath, and every crackle is a reminder that the floor itself is alive with the season. You reach the garderobe and glance down, rushes here too, but stiff, crusted and mixed with patches you don't want to identify. You hover your torch, the flame casting sharp shadows, and wonder how many years of footsteps have ground this mess into the stones. The sensory detail is overwhelming. The smell of herbs lingers faintly, lavender, thyme, but it's drowned by the tang of old moisture, sharp and sour. Your boots feel damp even before you realise the frost has seeped into the leather. You pull your cloak tighter, curse softly, and imagine the servants tasked with scraping out the rushes come spring. They'd use shovels, hauling clumps of frozen straw that stank of every season past. The job would take days, sometimes weeks, leaving bare stone floors until fresh rushes could be brought in by cart. In noble chambers, things were a little better. Fresh rushes scattered more often, and servants sprinkled dried flowers or even perfume to disguise the inevitable. But even velvet-lined chambers couldn't entirely escape the creeping damp. The cold stone of a castle always won in the end. One joke whispered in kitchens went, "The Lord thinks his floor smells of roses. Aye, until he slips on what froze beneath." Humour like that, you suspect, kept servants sane. You crouch down now, fingers brushing a tuft of straw stiff with ice. It crumbles, breaking apart like brittle twigs. Beneath you glimpse the slick stone, shining faintly with frost. The rushes were meant to shield feet from this surface, to provide warmth and comfort. Instead, they've become another frozen hazard, another reminder of how winter infiltrates everything. The irony isn't lost on you. The very thing laid to protect from cold has become a carrier of it. Think of the children in the castle, apprentices or pages, running errands across these floors. Their feet slip on hidden patches of ice beneath the straw. Their toes sting when frost creeps through thin shoes, and sometimes their tasks bring them right into garderobes, where the rushes are fouler still. No matter how carefully they skip, the smell clings. Imagine a boy returning to the hall, the scent of the privy following him like a shadow. Laughter greets him, though he burns with embarrassment. And yet, there's resilience in this. People learned to live with frozen rushes. They layered them thicker in winter, hoping the pile itself would insulate. They scattered ashes to soak up wetness, or sprinkled more herbs to keep spirits up. Some even shaped rush mats, woven more tightly, to place under beds or beside garderobes as stepping pads. Survival wasn't about eliminating discomfort, it was about making it tolerable. As you rise and walk back toward the hall, your boots crunching over frozen straw, you realise how much these details matter. It isn't just the draught in the garderobe or the waste in the moat that defined medieval winters. It was the daily grind of walking over damp rushes, smelling herbs mingled with the rot, and knowing that comfort was always temporary. The floor itself was a record of life. Meals eaten, accidents suffered, winters endured, and each crackle underfoot reminds you that history isn't polished marble. It's brittle straw, frozen with the traces of humanity. So tonight, as you tuck yourself into your imaginary castle bed, wool pulled tight against the draught, remember what lies beneath. Not just the stone, but the rushes, layers of daily living, frozen in time. And though they softened footsteps, they could never truly soften the hardships of a medieval winter. The castle feels quieter tonight, muffled by layers of snow outside and by the thick frost clinging to windows and stone. You take a deep breath, expecting the air to be sharp and clean, but it isn't. Even in the dead of winter, when cold slows rot, there's an undercurrent in the air. Foul, metallic, strangely sweet. It's the presence of waste, woven into the walls, rising from garderobe shafts, seeping from frozen rushes, and with that odour comes an invisible threat. Disease is never far away. You shuffle closer to the garderobe again, holding your cloak tight. The draught strikes your face like knives, but what really unnerves you isn't the cold. It's the idea that every breath carries risk. Medieval people believed in the miasma theory, that bad air, foul smells, carried sickness. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses, but they recognised a connection between stench and illness. And in winter, when waste froze and thawed in grotesque cycles, the suspicion only deepened. Mainstream fact: outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and other intestinal afflictions plagued medieval communities. Castles, despite their strong walls, weren't immune. Crowded halls, frozen toilets, and contaminated water supplies made for a breeding ground. Cold slowed some threats, yes, but it also trapped waste in place, so that when thaw came, disease often followed in waves. Written records from manors and strongholds complain of fluxes and ague striking entire households. Now here's a quirky tidbit that might make you smile nervously. Some medieval folk thought holding one's breath near a privy could save your life. They would rush in, clamp their nose shut, do their business in lightning speed and flee gasping. One satirist even joked about knights charging the garderobe like a battlefield, victorious if they emerged unscathed. You can almost picture yourself doing the same, puffing out your cheeks, counting heartbeats, then bolting for the door. Historians still argue whether winter truly protected people from disease or whether it merely delayed the inevitable. Some scholars suggest the cold reduced bacterial activity, giving temporary reprieve, while others point to evidence of epidemics raging even in January. Was it the indoor air, thick with smoke, damp with waste, that carried sickness more than the frozen moat outside? The question remains unsettled. What you feel, standing here in imagination, is the dread of not knowing. Every cough echoes through the hall, every groan from a fevered bed stirs whispers of plague. Picture yourself in the great hall now. A noble leans against the table, pale and sweating despite the chill. Servants glance nervously, wondering if the smell of the garderobe has poisoned him. A page whispers that the rushes are too foul, that disease has risen from them. Another insists the moat fumes are to blame. No one knows, but everyone fears. The fires crackle, yet the air feels heavy, poisoned by unseen forces. You huddle deeper in your cloak, telling yourself you're fine, even as your throat feels dry. And there's more. Rats scurry along the edges of the hall, their tiny feet crunching over frozen rushes. Cats chase them, but never enough. Fleas cling to fur, unseen carriers of worse threats. The waste in garderobe shafts provides perfect shelter for vermin, who dart in and out, thriving in spite of the cold. You can imagine one scuttling across your boot as you step into a privy chamber, your heart leaping as you realise the filth underfoot is more alive than you'd prefer. To ward off such dangers, people burned herbs constantly. The smoke of rosemary or juniper filled garderobes, not just to mask odour, but to fight the bad air thought to spread disease. Vinegar was splashed liberally, believed to purify surfaces. In wealthier households, perfumes were doused on clothes to keep contagion at bay. The faith in these measures was genuine, even if the science was flawed. And in a sense, they weren't entirely wrong. The smoke did repel insects, the vinegar killed some germs, the perfumes boosted morale. You find yourself respecting their stubborn fight, even as you wince at its limits. Imagine lying in your bed that night, straw mattress creaking beneath you, and hearing the coughs of others echoing through the halls. Every cough feels like a warning bell. The draught from the garderobe makes you pull the blanket over your face, convinced the air itself might sicken you. You clutch a sprig of lavender like a talisman, hoping its sharp scent is enough to ward off invisible demons. In the stillness you wonder, is it the cold that protects you, or is it hiding an enemy that will strike with spring's thaw? And here's a bit of humour that flickers through your tired mind. You imagine a medieval doctor leaning into a garderobe, sniffing deeply, then declaring with pompous certainty, "Yes, the smell is bad, therefore the cure is to burn more rosemary." You can't help chuckling, though it's a nervous laugh. After all, his prescription isn't so far from what everyone is already doing. The line between medicine and household chores was thinner than you'd like to think. As you drift closer to sleep in this imagined castle, the awareness of disease never leaves. The air is cold, sharp, but it isn't clean. The rushes crunch with hidden dangers. The moat groans beneath its frozen burden. The garderobe breathes draughts that feel like whispers of illness. And you realise that winter didn't erase the problem. It only dressed it differently. Less smell, more dread, waiting for the moment when spring unsealed everything. So you burrow deeper under your wool blankets, comforted by the fire's faint crackle, and hope the night passes without fever. Because in this castle winter, disease lingers in every breath, hidden in the chill air, ready to remind you that stone walls and noble banners mean little when the invisible enemy rises from the shadows. You rise in the night again, shifting uncomfortably on your straw mattress, and realise the pressure in your stomach leaves you no choice but to find relief. The torch flickers as you pad through the chill corridors, but the moment you step into the garderobe, you confront another reality of medieval castle life. Privacy was rare, often non-existent. If you thought you'd be alone in your misery, you're in for a rude awakening. The chamber is narrow, its walls sweating with damp. You shuffle forward, expecting solitude, but discover another figure already hunched over the neighbouring hole. Yes, this garderobe is communal. Multiple seats are carved side by side into a long wooden bench, divided only by the vaguest of partitions, if at all. You freeze awkwardly, torn between turning away or pretending this is normal. But for medieval people, it was normal. You sigh, settle onto the seat, and try not to meet your neighbour's eye as both of you shiver in the draught. Mainstream history makes it plain. Many garderobes were built for efficiency, not privacy. Archaeological remains of castles show rows of chutes, some with 2 or 3 holes aligned over the same shaft. In monasteries, dozens could be seated in a line, each with their own opening, communal as a choir. The design allowed multiple people to relieve themselves at once, an efficient if humiliating arrangement. And in winter, when trudging to the garderobe was misery, waiting for your turn wasn't practical. Sharing was expected. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you grin despite yourself. In some castles, garderobes doubled as social spots, where gossip was traded as freely as in the Great Hall. Chronicles mention squires whispering battle news, servants muttering about lords, even nobles conducting hurried discussions. Imagine sitting side by side, shivering, and still hashing out politics or gossip about who flirted at last night's feast. It sounds absurd, but when every other chamber is bustling, the garderobe might be the only place where candour slipped through. Historians still argue over how embarrassed people really were. Did medieval folk have the same sense of privacy we do today, or were they more casual about bodily functions? Some scholars insist that communal use was practical and accepted, while others suggest that embarrassment lingered, masked by jokes and banter. Perhaps, as with most things, it depended on the situation. Soldiers on campaign were probably less modest, while nobles still preferred a more private arrangement when possible. But the debate continues, leaving us unsure just how red cheeks burned in those drafty cubicles. You shift on your seat, the icy wind swirling around your legs. The person beside you clears their throat, offers a weak smile, then stares determinedly at the wall. The silence is unbearable. To fill it, you think of medieval humour. Scatological jokes were rampant in songs and poems, mocking priests, nobles and peasants alike for their bathroom habits. Maybe someone here hums a tune to distract from the sound of splashes below, or cracks a joke about the draught to ease the tension. After all, laughter was as vital as lavender in softening the experience. But privacy issues weren't just about sharing the bench. The walls of garderobes were thin, sometimes little more than wooden partitions separating them from bedchambers. In the still of night, sound carried. Groans, sighs, the unmistakable splash of waste hitting the moat ice. You can imagine nobles pretending not to hear their lords or ladies, trying to keep straight faces as the noises echoed faintly through stone. In smaller castles, even the lord's private garderobe might share a shaft with those of servants, meaning the sounds and smells mingled regardless of status. Stone made no allowance for dignity. Now imagine the great hall after a feast. Bellies full of roasted meats and heavy ale meant crowded garderobes. Lines formed, torches flickering, people jostling for space. Privacy dissolved entirely, shoulder to shoulder, cloak to cloak, nobles and squires alike waiting their turn. The stench intensified, the draughts swirled, and the chatter filled the space with nervous energy. One might joke loudly, "Ah, a true test of fellowship to sit here together," while another muttered curses under their breath. For you, it's awkward beyond words. For them, it was simply life. and sometimes there was no time to wait. Servants carried pots into corners, screens hastily erected in chambers, dignity sacrificed for urgency. Picture a drunken knight stumbling from the hall, demanding relief, and being guided behind a tapestry rather than out into the frozen yard. The sound of rushing ale meeting a ceramic pot, muffled awkwardly by music and laughter, privacy even then was an illusion. You rise from your seat now, pulling your cloak around you, and glance once more at your neighbour. They nod, expression half embarrassed, half amused. You both exit, boots crunching on frozen rushes, and part ways silently. In that brief encounter, you've shared more intimacy than most friendships, and it reminds you of the deeper truth. Castles weren't built for privacy. They were built for defence, for authority, for show. The human need for solitude was a luxury few could afford. So as you retreat to your bed, pulling woolen blankets close, you realise that medieval life was lived in company, even in the garderobe. The notion of slipping quietly into a private bathroom, closing a door and enjoying silence is a modern dream. Here, in this stone fortress, privacy dissolves into drafts, echoes, and shared embarrassment. You may long for solitude, but tonight your relief came with company, and the unsettling realisation that dignity was always in short supply. The castle has roared with life all day, the kitchens working like furnaces, servants racing with trenchers of meat and pitchers of ale, musicians plucking away at lutes while jugglers stumble for laughter. Now the feast is at full blaze. You sit in the great hall, firelight glowing across banners and shields, while the air grows thick with smoke, laughter, and the tang of roasted venison. Cups of ale and wine spill, plates groan under roasted fowl, and the steady drone of conversation hums like bees in a hive. You can feel the warmth at first, but soon the crush of people and the heavy food weighs on you, and with it comes the inevitable. Your stomach rumbles. Perhaps it was the greasy mutton, perhaps the strong cider, or maybe the simple fact that you've eaten more in one sitting than your body usually tolerates. At first, you shift in your seat, convincing yourself it will pass. You gulp down another sip of wine, trying to wash it away, but that only worsens the pressure. Then it strikes you, an urgent, unmistakable call. Nature doesn't wait for protocol. You need to leave, now. The problem is that you aren't alone in this plight. All across the hall, bellies are filling, and with every toast the guardrobes become more necessary. Servants move discreetly, carrying small chamber pots behind screens tucked in corners. But even so, you see guests excusing themselves, rising from benches and weaving unsteadily toward the narrow corridors that lead to the privies. The sight makes you sweat. There may be a line, and in this cold, waiting is its own torture. Mainstream history backs this scene up. Banquets were notorious for causing digestive distress. Chroniclers write of nobles staggering out mid-feast, unable to hold their ale, or of guardrobes overwhelmed during celebrations. Feasts weren't delicate affairs, they were sprawling, indulgent, and often chaotic. Guests drank far more than they should, ate beyond reason, and the consequences were predictable. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval households kept close stools handy, portable chairs with chamber pots hidden beneath the seat. These were set up behind tapestries or in adjoining rooms, so that noble guests didn't have to risk a long draughty trip mid-feast. Imagine pulling aside a curtain to reveal a cushioned chair, ornate in carving, but designed for the least glamorous of purposes. It was a privilege, but also a bit of an open secret. Everyone knew why someone had slipped behind that curtain, even if they pretended otherwise. Historians still debate whether these mid-feast emergencies were laughed off or considered scandalous. Some suggest nobles treated them casually. After all, everyone ate and drank together, so everyone shared the consequences. Others argue that etiquette demanded absolute discretion, with servants covering up the evidence and gossip quietly circulating afterward. Perhaps both were true, depending on the company. A raucous nightly gathering might laugh openly, while a solemn court would pretend nothing had happened. But here you are, shuffling from the hall, cloak clutched, cheeks flushed with both drink and embarrassment. You join the line in the corridor, a cluster of guests swaying with impatience. The torchlight reveals their discomfort, tapping feet, shifting hips, muttered curses under breath. The draught from the guardrobe shaft wafts toward you, making you shiver even before you've sat down. One by one they go in, emerging with relief written across their faces. At last, it's your turn. You stumble inside, lowering yourself onto the icy seat with a hiss of breath. The contrast between the heat of the hall and the chill of this chamber is shocking, like plunging into a frozen stream after standing by the fire. The smell is sharper than usual tonight. Too many people, too much food, too much ale. The shaft groans with the weight of offerings, and you clutch the sides of the seat, wondering how long it will be before the whole system clogs. Your stomach growls again, but at least you've made it. You imagine others aren't so lucky, perhaps still in line, still dancing in place in the corridor, praying they won't humiliate themselves before their peers. And here's where medieval humour thrives. Jesters and jongleurs were quick to turn such mishaps into jokes. One fool might burst into the hall later, waving a chamber pot and singing a satirical verse about the knight who couldn't wait. Another might mime clutching his belly and sprinting, sending the table into laughter. Crude? Certainly. But laughter was a shield against shame, and feasts often blurred the line between dignity and disaster. Now picture the servants during all this. While nobles grumble, they sprint with pots, emptying and replacing, scattering herbs to mask the odour. They dart behind tapestries, collect close stools, and lug their loads to the cesspit or moat. Their arms ache, their noses wrinkle, but they keep moving. Without them, the feast would collapse into chaos. And yet no one thanks them. Their work is invisible, overshadowed by the merriment in the hall. You return from the guardrobe, cloak wrapped tight, and sink back onto the bench at the feast. The warmth of the fire feels glorious after that icy ordeal, but you notice others leaving too, one after another, the cycle never ending. The hall smells faintly of spiced wine and roasted goose, but underneath, if you breathe carefully, you catch the ghost of something less pleasant wafting in from the corridors. You chuckle to yourself. It's the true soundtrack of the medieval feast, hidden beneath the laughter and music. As the night deepens, bellies grow heavier, and some guests don't even bother leaving. Screens are drawn, pots are fetched, and servants bow politely as they carry away the evidence. The feast rages on, oblivious to the quiet emergencies solved behind the scenes. You realise that in a medieval castle, indulgence and discomfort were never far apart. The banquet table and the garderobe were two sides of the same coin. So as you drain your final cup and stumble toward your straw bed, you reflect on the night's ordeal. Feasts were glorious, yes, songs, laughter, blazing fires, but they were also ripe with emergencies. And in winter, when drafts cut through guardrobes like knives, those emergencies turned into icy adventures you'd never forget. You may have survived tonight without humiliation, but you'll never look at a medieval banquet scene in a painting again without imagining the long shivering line outside the privy door. The feast may leave you groaning with too much meat and ale, but as you stagger toward the ramparts in your imagination, another truth about medieval waste makes itself clear. Human filth was not only endured, it was weaponized. The castle's garderobes, cesspits, and foul-smelling moats weren't just byproducts of life. In times of siege, they became part of the defence. And if you thought sitting on a freezing seat was miserable, imagine standing below the wall, while defenders above made strategic use of what had been piling up all winter. The wind howls across the battlements as you picture yourself peering over the parapet. Below, the moat is a grotesque mixture of frozen patches and sluggish water, layered with waste tossed down from guardrobes and buckets. In summer, it reeks so strongly that attackers gag before they even get close. But in winter, when armies sometimes attempted surprise sieges, the defenders could use the frozen cess to their advantage. Mainstream history confirms this. Waste was deliberately hurled at besiegers. Chronicles record defenders pouring boiling water, heated sand, quicklime, and yes, human excrement over enemies' scaling ladders. The logic was grim but effective. Waste caused burns if heated, infection if it seeped into wounds, and morale collapse simply from disgust. A knight brave enough to charge into battle might still falter if splattered with sewage. The castle, in its way, used its own filth as a chemical weapon centuries before the term existed. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some guardrobes were designed with vertical shafts that open not only into moats, but directly onto the outer wall face. Archaeologists have identified murder holes and defensive latrines that could double as dumping channels. Imagine leaning out in desperation during a siege, emptying buckets onto the helmets of men below, the waste freezing in the cold air as it falls. It's grotesque, but also strangely ingenious, turning the castle's weakest feature into a tactical surprise. Historians still debate just how intentional this was. Did architects deliberately design guardrobes with defence in mind? Or was their location on outer walls simply a matter of sanitation convenience? Some scholars argue that their positioning was dual purpose from the start. Others suggest defenders only discovered the opportunity later, adapting necessity into strategy. The truth may be blurred, but the image is vivid. Waste cascading from above, chilling, choking, and breaking the spirit of besiegers. Step into that scene for a moment. You're an attacker, trudging through the snow with a ladder, shield strapped to your arm, heart pounding with the promise of glory. You brace the ladder against the icy wall and begin to climb. Suddenly the defenders shout above. A bucket tips. Down it comes. A torrent of slop, half frozen, stinking beyond belief. It splashes your armour, seeps under your collar, and in the freezing cold it clings like tar. You slip, gag, lose your footing. Your comrades scatter. The defenders jeer from above. Your courage curdles into nausea. The siege falters, not from swords, but from sewage. The defenders inside the castle meanwhile laugh grimly as they tip another bucket. They know the waste is endless, supplied daily by their own bodies. It's the one resource they can't run out of. Food may dwindle, water may freeze, but waste keeps coming. In its foul way, it becomes a renewable weapon. You almost admire the dark practicality of it, even as your nose wrinkles at the thought. Think of the psychological power. A besieging army, already cold and hungry, now dreads approaching the walls because of what might be dumped from above. Stories spread quickly. Don't climb that side, they throw their filth there. Soldiers mutter in disgust, morale slipping. And in war, morale is as crucial as steel. The servants play their part too. They haul chamber pots not just to empty them, but to stockpile ammunition for the next assault. Imagine a pile of buckets ready by the wall, the stench gagging even defenders, but preserved for the crucial moment. Some even joked about saving the Lord's chamber pot for the commander of the enemy, an insult layered atop a tactic. You can almost hear the laughter as they prepare this grim artillery. Of course, not all castles relied on such methods. Some historians insist these accounts are exaggerated, colourful tales to humiliate enemies. Yet archaeological traces of waste-laden moats and records of defenders hurling foul missiles suggest there is truth behind the stories. Whether occasional or regular, the fact remains. In the brutal calculus of survival, nothing was wasted, not even waste itself. You walk along the battlements now, the torch in your hands sputtering in the wind, and you imagine the defenders in their winter cloaks, stamping their feet for warmth while laughing at the sight below. To them, this is as much a weapon as the bear or the boiling oil. To you, it is a humbling reminder that war is never noble. It is desperate, filthy, and cruel. And here's a small joke you can't resist. The next time someone talks of dirty tactics, you'll remember this scene literally. Medieval war wasn't just chivalric knights and banners fluttering. It was buckets of dung hurled from a wall. So as you return to your chamber, shivering, you realise how inseparable sanitation and defence were in a castle. The guardrobe wasn't only a place of drafty discomfort, it was also, in its way, a weapon. The same shaft that chilled your backside in winter could chill an enemy's heart in battle. And that duality, filth as both curse and shield, sums up medieval life better than any polished chronicle. Morning dawns grey and brittle, the kind of light that makes the frost sparkle but does nothing to warm your bones. You stand on the parapet, breath misting, and look down once more at the moat. What you see is no longer just ice. It's a bizarre landscape of frozen ridges and runnels where waste has flowed, slowed, and finally stopped in midstream. These are the frozen rivers of disposal, the castle's secret geography sculpted by human need and winter's grip. Picture it. The guardrobe shafts have been working for months, and every pot emptied into the moat adds to the flow. But the moment temperatures drop below freezing, the liquid hardens. Instead of vanishing, it forms rivulets that spread across the surface, branching like grotesque tributaries. By January, the moat resembles a frozen delta, its veins not of water, but of waste. The sight is both absurd and unsettling. You can almost trace the lives of the castle's inhabitants by the layers beneath your feet. Mainstream history acknowledges this reality. Archaeologists studying cesspits and moat sediments find layers upon layers of waste, sometimes frozen into place for months. Soil samples reveal pollen, seeds, parasite eggs, and even the diets of medieval people, preserved because the cold and anaerobic muck kept them intact. What disgusts you tonight is treasure for scholars centuries later, tiny frozen archives of daily life. But for those living it, the accumulation was a nightmare. Here's a quirky tidbit that makes you raise your eyebrows. There are accounts of children daring each other to skate or slide across the moat in winter, ignoring the warnings of adults. The ice was often thick enough to hold them, though it cracked ominously. Imagine the laughter and shrieks as a boy slips, sprawls across the ice, and rises covered in filth-stained frost. His friends roar with laughter, his mother pulls her hair in despair, and the stench lingers on him for days. It sounds like foolishness, and it was, but it's also painfully human. Children find games even in the most revolting of places. Historians still debate how much effort was spent clearing these frozen ridges. Did servants venture onto the ice with poles to smash and shift them, or did they simply leave the mess until spring thaw? Some argue that labourers regularly maintained the moat to prevent clogging, while others suggest the cold was excuse enough to let filth pile as high as it liked. The truth may have depended on urgency. If the moat threatened to overflow or block drainage channels, then action was unavoidable. Otherwise, why risk frostbite or drowning in filth when nature would eventually do the work for you? Now step closer in imagination. The air burns your lungs, but you kneel by the edge and run your gloved hand across the surface. It's rough, uneven, jagged. You see streaks of brown and grey frozen mid-drip, ridges where a bucket's worth of waste froze in place before it spread. Small bones from the kitchen stick out here and there, frozen like fossils in amber. A chicken claw, a fish spine, even a broken ladle tossed carelessly away, all caught in the icy sculpture. You recoil, then laugh nervously. It's grotesque, but it's also strangely mesmerising, a portrait of the castle's hidden life painted in filth. Servants know this sight all too well. At dawn they shuffle to the moat, their breath pluming, and chip at the surface with poles. They prod the ridges, breaking off chunks that tumble into the darker water below. The sound is grotesque, like brittle pottery shattering followed by a hollow splash. The work is endless. By midday, more waste has joined, building the rivers anew, and by nightfall they've frozen again, undoing the morning's efforts. You can almost hear the muttered curses. The moat feeds itself faster than we can empty it. Inside the castle, people pretend not to notice. They sip mulled wine, roast chestnuts, and scatter herbs across rushes. But when the wind shifts, the smell creeps in, faint but undeniable. Guests wrinkle their noses and whisper, "The moat speaks again." Children giggle at the phrase, while adults sigh. The frozen rivers are no secret, just an unmentionable reality that everyone endures. One small joke circulates among the garrison. Better to fall into the moat in summer than to break your leg on it in winter. It's gallows humour, yes, but it rings true. The frozen ridges are slick, treacherous. A careless soldier might tumble, landing hard, bruised more by filth than by ice. The sight would spark laughter at first, then grim work as comrades drag him out, muttering about the smell that will cling to him for weeks. But beyond the humour lies real danger. When thaw finally comes, the frozen rivers don't vanish politely. They melt in torrents, sending waves of filth crashing against the walls, spilling into nearby ditches, even flooding courtyards if drainage is poor. Disease spreads, morale drops, and complaints rise to the Lord's ears. Yet by then, it's too late. Winter's legacy is unleashed, and all anyone can do is endure until the waters settle. Historians still argue about whether medieval engineers ever truly controlled this cycle. Some castles had elaborate drainage systems, sluices to wash waste away, or pits dug deep enough to contain the worst. Others were poorly designed, leaving their inhabitants at the mercy of thaw. You wonder how many sieges, famines, or outbreaks of disease were worsened simply by the timing of the seasons. Cold might preserve life one month, only to destroy it the next. You straighten up from the moat now, stamping your feet against the cold. The rivers glisten faintly in the weak sunlight, grotesque yet oddly beautiful. They are reminders of survival, of the persistence of human need even in the harshest conditions. No king, no servant, no child escaped their making. Every frozen ridge was democracy in action, a mingling of all stations of life. So as you trudge back through the courtyard, cloak pulled tight, You think of the irony. Castles were built to be impregnable, monuments of strength and majesty. Yet their most enduring features in winter weren't banners or battlements, but frozen rivers of filth carving strange landscapes at their foundations. And perhaps that's the truest picture of medieval life. Not the glory of stone towers, but the humbling reminder that every fortress was also, inevitably, a giant latrine. The castle at night is quiet again, but not empty. In the shadows of the corridors, small figures stir, children, pages, and apprentices moving through the routines of survival. While nobles retreat to cushioned beds and servants shuffle with their buckets, the youngest inhabitants of the fortress face the same problem as everyone else: nature's call in the dead of winter. And if adults grumble at the drafty garderobes and frozen chamber pots, imagine what it was like for children trying to cope. You picture a boy of 10, his hair sticking up from straw bedding, eyes still hazy with sleep. He stirs under his rough blanket, feels the pressure in his stomach, and groans. He knows what it means. He can't just ignore it, not after the feast of beans and bread at supper. But stepping into the corridor in the freezing dark terrifies him. The torches are few and far between. The draughts whisper through the walls like voices, and worst of all, the garderobe feels like a tunnel into some abyss, a place where monsters might lurk just beneath the hole. Mainstream fact: many medieval castles trained boys as pages, apprentices, and squires from as young as 7. They lived within the walls, serving nobles, learning skills and enduring the same daily discomforts as adults. That included finding their way to garderobes or using chamber pots. Childhood offered no exemption from necessity, though it often made the ordeal more frightening. And here's a quirky tidbit that makes you grin. Some parents and mentors reassured children with tales that garderobes could swallow bad dreams. A child too afraid to sit on the hole was told that letting go would send nightmares tumbling into the moat, carried away forever. Whether this soothed or terrified them further is up for debate, but it shows how imagination softened the experience. A scared child might breathe easier if they believed their monsters were being flushed out along with everything else. Historians still argue about how children managed their fears in castles. Did they mostly rely on chamber pots at night, leaving garderobes to adults? Or were they expected to toughen up quickly, taught to face the cold and dark as part of their training? Some evidence points to children being excused from late-night trips, while other accounts describe boys sent on errands to fetch herbs or buckets even at midnight. The debate remains open, leaving us to imagine both scenarios. Now follow that boy again. He slips from his straw bed, clutching a small rushlight barely brighter than a candle stub. The flame trembles with every draught. He tiptoes down the corridor, trying not to wake older apprentices. His bare feet sting against the rushes, frozen stiff. He mutters a prayer under his breath, hoping the garderobe isn't already occupied. The corridor stretches endlessly, every creak of wood making him flinch. Finally he reaches the little door, pushes it open, and nearly loses his nerve as the icy wind strikes his face. Inside, the cold bites worse. The boy lowers himself onto the seat, teeth chattering, eyes wide as he stares into the darkness below. He tries not to imagine creatures in the shaft or the splash echoing down into the moat. He hums softly to distract himself, some half-remembered tune from the kitchen. When he's done, he bolts upright, pulls his cloak tighter, and runs back down the hall, rushlight guttering dangerously. Relief washes over him, not just from the act itself, but from surviving the ordeal. For him, every trip is a test of courage. Girls too lived in castles, daughters of nobles, wards sent for fostering, or young servants working alongside their mothers. They faced the same challenges, though perhaps with even less privacy. In some cases, they relied more heavily on chamber pots in their rooms, both for modesty and convenience. A girl huddled with her sisters in a cold chamber might share one pot between them, taking turns under the thin light of a candle. In the morning, a maid would carry it away, her nose wrinkling, her hands practiced at balancing the heavy load. And what of the apprentices? Those teenagers training in trades or duties? They were expected to cope with everything. A boy apprenticed to the kitchens might dash to a privy between carrying heavy trays. Another, serving in the stables, might simply relieve himself near a frozen wall if urgency struck, avoiding the dreaded shaft altogether. Apprentices learned quickly where the risks were, which garderobes had the worst draughts, which pots filled fastest, which corridors were least patrolled. Their knowledge of the castle's hidden geography of waste became second nature, passed down like unspoken law. You imagine them joking about it in stolen moments of camaraderie. Use the west shaft if you want frostbite, one teases. Better to brave the moat than that one, another replies. Laughter echoes through the cold halls, a small rebellion against discomfort. Their humour is crude, yes, but necessary. What else can you do when you're half frozen, crouched over a hole in the wall? And sometimes the laughter fades into accident. Children too small to balance properly on the wide wooden seats occasionally slipped. Stories linger of boys or girls tumbling, legs flailing, rescued at the last moment by panicked siblings. The terror of such close calls stayed with them, whispered as warnings. Hold tight, or the moat will take you. You shiver at the thought, realising how the very design of the guardrobe made childhood more precarious. Yet for all the fear and embarrassment, children adapted. They learned to carry herbs in their pockets, crushing them to sniff when the smell overwhelmed. They memorised shortcuts to avoid long waits. They mastered the art of speed, slipping in and out in record time, and in their way, they became tougher for it. If you could survive the castle's privies in January, you could survive almost anything. One small joke rings in your head, perhaps whispered by an older squire to a nervous boy. If you can face the moat's breath at midnight, you can face an enemy's sword at dawn. It's ridiculous, but also revealing. Coping with the guardrobe was, in its way, training for endurance. Every trip hardened the body and the spirit, preparing children for the larger battles of life. So as you picture the youngest inhabitants of the castle tonight, curled back in their straw beds, you realise they endured the same cycle as everyone else. They feared, they adapted, they joked, they stumbled, they coped. And though their memories of childhood in a castle might include tales of nights and feasts, they also carried quieter, colder recollections. The draughty garderobe, the frozen pot, the terrifying echoes of the shaft below. Those memories shaped them, just as surely as sword drills or embroidery lessons did. The castle you've been wandering in imagination is alive, not only with its own people, but also with strangers, merchants, envoys, pilgrims, chroniclers, who pass through the gates, stay a night or two, and carry their impressions into the wider world. And if there is one thing foreign travellers always notice, it's the toilets. Food, music, and banners may impress them, but the draughty guard-robes and the stinking moat leave the sharpest mark. Their comments, sometimes disgusted, sometimes amused, have become part of the record that lets us peek at how outsiders viewed this very human side of medieval life. You picture an Italian merchant, fur-lined cloak pulled tight as he scribbles by candlelight in his journal. He praises the castle's fine hall and the generosity of its lord, but then he adds a line that makes you chuckle. The privies are most cruel, for the wind enters there as if from the very Alps, and I feared to sit lest my bones freeze. That's not the kind of detail painted in illuminated manuscripts, but it's exactly the sort of thing a weary traveller remembered. Mainstream history provides plenty of evidence for these outsider perspectives. Chroniclers from warmer climates often commented on Northern Europe's privies, shocked by the cold, the draughts, and the sheer openness of garderobes perched above moats. Even within regions, differences stood out. A traveller from a well-appointed Italian villa might find English castles unbearably crude, while a German knight might sneer at the lack of privacy in French strongholds. Toilets became small but vivid markers of cultural difference. Here's a quirky tidbit. One 15th century Burgundian visitor described English garderobes as airy balconies where a man might freeze his dignity away. He meant it as mockery, of course, but it's also an accidental compliment to the castle's defensive design, because those same balconies were effective ways to drop waste clear of the walls. Still, his turn of phrase tells you how unforgettable the experience was. He could have written about knights and battles, but what stuck in his mind was the cold blast against his rear. Historians still debate whether travellers exaggerated these accounts to entertain their readers, or whether conditions were truly as shocking as they claimed. Some argue that foreigners delighted in poking fun at rival nations, painting their castles as filthy or uncomfortable to bolster national pride. Others suggest the complaints were genuine, preserved because toilets were such a universal experience. After all, everyone could relate to the ordeal of a bad privy. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, exaggeration mixed with honest disgust. Now imagine a Moorish diplomat from Al-Andalus, accustomed to the sophisticated bathhouses of Islamic Spain, visiting a northern castle in January. He's used to warm water, scented oils, tiled walls. He enters a draughty stone garderobe here, sits once, and recoils in horror. Later he writes a letter describing the castle as noble in battle, but barbarous in comfort. You can see why. To him, the castle's sanitation is primitive, a sign of a culture less refined. His commentary spreads through courts, reinforcing stereotypes about northern harshness. Not all travellers were entirely critical, though. Some marvelled at the practical ingenuity. A Venetian trader once remarked with a kind of grudging respect, "The waste is cast into the moat, so that no man within need fear the stink of pits." He saw efficiency where others saw filth. To him, it was simply a system, crude perhaps, but effective in its own way. Perspective mattered, and so did expectations. You can imagine the gossip these travellers spread once they returned home. A knight might regale his comrades with tales of frozen guardrobes, exaggerating the draughts until his listeners laughed. A monk might record the filth in his chronicle, using it as a moral lesson about worldly vanity. A merchant might complain to his wife about the smell clinging to his cloak after a stay. And so the reputation of castles grew, not just as fortresses of stone, but as places of peculiar discomfort. Think of the servants overhearing these complaints. To them, it must have been odd to hear foreigners so horrified by what they considered normal. A page might mutter, "If he thinks this bad, wait until spring thaw." Another might laugh, "In his country, perhaps they have golden seats." Their humour masked the sting of criticism, but also reflected pride in endurance. What outsiders saw as barbarous, insiders saw as proof of toughness. And here's a joke you can't resist. Imagine a French envoy writing home after a winter feast in England. His letter reads, "The food was hearty, the wine plentiful, but the privy was colder than the king's welcome." A sly insult, yes, but also evidence that toilets doubled as metaphors in diplomacy. As you drift back to your chamber in this imagined castle, you realise that toilets tell stories not just about waste, but about culture. To locals, the garderobe was a fact of life. To foreigners, it was an experience worth recording, mocking, or marvelling at. And those comments, scattered across chronicles and letters, give us a chorus of voices reminding us that history is lived not only in grand halls but also in draughty corners above moats. So tonight, as you settle under your blankets, you hear echoes of those travellers' remarks. Some laugh, some gag, some complain bitterly. All of them remind you that castles, for all their majesty, were never immune from the most basic truth. Everyone had to sit, and no one forgot how cold it was. The wind moans through the garderobe shaft again tonight, carrying with it not just icy air but stories. Whispers that cling to the stones like frost. In a castle where every draught seems alive, superstition finds fertile ground. People feared the privy not only for its chill or its stench, but also for what might be lurking there in spirit. After all, what better place for demons or ghosts to haunt than a dark hole leading to a pit of filth, where the living felt vulnerable and alone? You shuffle down the corridor, rushlight sputtering, and the atmosphere feels different. It isn't just the cold, it's the way shadows cluster near the garderobe door. You pause, listening. Somewhere within you think you hear a sigh, low and guttural, carried by the wind. Your skin prickles. Rationally, you know it's only air rushing through the shaft. But this is the Middle Ages, where the line between natural and supernatural blurs easily. Mainstream fact. Medieval people often linked foul smells with evil. The miasma theory of disease merged with superstition, convincing many that bad air wasn't just unhealthy, but spiritually dangerous. Latrines and cesspits became liminal spaces, doorways between the clean and the corrupt, the safe and the damned. Tales circulated of demons that clung to filth, waiting to seize those foolish enough to linger too long. Monks even wrote prayers to be said before entering the privy, invoking protection from both illness and unclean spirits. And here's a quirky tidbit. One German folktale tells of a toilet kobold, a mischievous spirit who lived in latrines. He was said to tug at people's clothes or make strange noises to startle them, sometimes even giving advice in riddles if treated with respect. Imagine sitting there in the icy dark, hearing a voice echo from below, and convincing yourself it's a kobold offering wisdom. Comforting? Maybe. Terrifying? Absolutely. Historians still argue over how seriously people believed these tales. Were they genuine fears, guiding daily behaviour, or just cautionary stories told to children? Some evidence suggests adults avoided certain guardrobes at night, muttering that something lurked there. Others dismiss it as folklore layered onto mundane reality, yet the persistence of such stories across regions, from England's privy devils to Scandinavian legends of trolls in cesspits, suggests the fear ran deep. Now picture a young servant girl, clutching a torch as she approaches the guardrobe in the small hours. She hesitates at the threshold, remembering her mother's warning, "Never go alone, for the hole can swallow more than waste." She whispers a quick prayer to St. Catherine, then steps inside, heart pounding. The draught rushes upward, wailing like a voice, and she nearly bolts. She forces herself to sit quickly, all the while glancing over her shoulder, convinced a shadow might solidify into claws. When she's finished, she runs back to her chamber, breathless with both relief and fear. In noble circles, the fear took subtler forms. A lord might insist on incense burning constantly in his guardrobe, not just to mask smell, but to banish evil vapours. A lady might hang charms or crosses near the seat, convinced these would keep demons at bay. Some castles even built guardrobes with narrow slits for light, believing sunlight could drive away spirits. The architecture itself reflected the superstition. Practical, yes, but also psychological. And here's where humour crept in. Castle jesters told ribald tales of demons in guardrobes who punished greedy nobles. One popular joke imagined a miserly baron dragged down the shaft by imps, his treasure spilling after him into the cesspit. Laughter echoed through halls, but beneath the joke lay real unease. Everyone knew how exposed you felt in that seat, perched between dignity and danger. By the hearth at night, servants swapped their own tales. "Did you hear the moaning from the West Tower privy?" one whispers. "They say a soldier fell down it years ago, and now his ghost lingers." Another swears she saw red eyes glowing in the shaft when she carried out pots at dawn. The stories grow with every telling, each listener adding details. For children, it's terrifying. For adults, it's a reminder that fear keeps people cautious. You step into the guardrobe in your imagination, holding the torch high. The smoke curls, shadows leap, and the wind whistles a sound that almost forms words. You swallow hard, reminding yourself it's just air. But your mind wanders to all those who sat here before, trembling, whispering prayers, or muttering charms. The shaft seems bottomless, the darkness alive. You can almost believe that if you lean too far, something might reach up and pull you down. Superstition also shaped practical behaviour. Some people refused to use guardrobes at night, relying only on chamber pots. Others avoided certain shafts altogether, declaring them cursed. Even noble families might order extra herbs burned in specific privies, convinced they were unclean. These practices, whether rooted in fear or habit, show how deep the unease ran. And in winter, when the draughts howled louder and the castle creaked with ice, the whispers of superstition grew stronger. Every sound became suspect. Every gust of wind felt like a sigh from below. Sitting in the guardrobe wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a brush with the unknown. One jest you can't resist. Imagine a monk scrawling in his chronicle, "Demons are strongest in the privy," only for a later reader to smirk and think. Perhaps he simply disliked the smell. Yet even that smirk acknowledges the power of belief. People feared what they couldn't see, and in the dark shafts of castles there was plenty unseen. So as you leave the guardrobe tonight, torchlight fading behind you, you glance back one last time. The door swings shut, but you swear you still hear the faintest sigh. Was it just wind? Probably. But in the chill silence of the castle, you understand why superstition clung so tightly. The guardrobe wasn't only a place of necessity, it was a place where imagination met fear, where the line between waste and whispers blurred, and where even the bravest knight might admit he felt a shiver that wasn't just from the cold. The castle breathes differently now. The icy grip of January has loosened, and the first timid warmth of spring creeps into the air. You feel it when you press your palm to the stone wall, still cold, but not biting. Outside, icicles drip from the battlements like tiny hourglasses, ticking away the final moments of winter. Birds return, their calls bright in the morning light. Life stirs. But with the relief comes a darker reality. All that filth winter locked away is waking up too. You step onto the ramparts and glance down at the moat. Where once a glittering crust of ice concealed months of disposal, cracks now web across the surface. Water laps greedily at the edges, swallowing the frozen ridges of waste that have been preserved for weeks. What was silent is now noisy, gurgling, creaking, splashing. The thaw has begun, and it brings with it a stench so powerful that your stomach lurches. Mainstream history is unambiguous here. Spring thaws turned castle sanitation into a crisis. Moats swelled with melted snow, carrying months of accumulated waste back into circulation. Cesspits overflowed, their frozen walls collapsing. The first warm winds didn't just bring blossoms, they carried sickness. Chronicles describe waves of dysentery striking households just as winter seemed conquered. The irony is sharp. Survival through the cold only to be undone by the filth it preserved. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some castles scheduled great cleaning days in spring, massive efforts to shovel, drain and scrape away the build-up before it overwhelmed the fortress. Entire teams of servants, sometimes even prisoners, were ordered into the muck. They scraped frozen waste from guardrape shafts, hauled it by cart and dumped it far outside the walls, or spread it on fields as fertiliser. Imagine that grim festival, a week of stinking labour, celebrated not with music but with vinegar-soaked rags tied over faces. It was as much ritual as necessity, and no one looked forward to it. Historians still argue about how much the thaw influenced epidemics. Was it really the melting waste that unleashed disease? Or were outbreaks simply coincidental with crowded springtime living? Some point to archaeological evidence of parasites in moat sediments as proof that thaw released infection. Others insist that stagnant air indoors played a larger role. The debate continues, but standing here in your imagination, gagging on the first spring wind, you're inclined to believe the muck was guilty. Now follow a servant down to the moat's edge. His boots sink into mud that only yesterday was solid frost. He grips a pole, prods at the melting ridges, and watches chunks of filth collapse into the water with sickening plops. The smell rises instantly, thick and sweet, coating his tongue. He gags, mutters curses, and keeps working. By afternoon he's joined by others, all chipping, scraping, hauling. The air resounds with the clatter of shovels, the slosh of buckets, the groans of labour. It's spring cleaning at its most literal, and it's disgusting. You glance toward the guardrabe shafts above. Water drips steadily, thawing ice sending rivulets down the stone. The wood of the seats inside is damp, swollen, sour-smelling. Herbs that once masked odours have long since dried to dust. The servants climb up with rags and vinegar, scrubbing furiously. Their hands are raw, their noses red, but the work must be done. If they don't, the castle will drown in its own winter legacy. Meanwhile, nobles grumble. They wrinkle their noses at the smell in the courtyards, complain of headaches, demand more incense. Some mutter about omens, convinced the stench is a curse. A few even leave the castle temporarily, retreating to country estates until the worst passes. Their absence leaves servants to bear the brunt of the labour, but that has always been the way. The higher the title, the further one tries to rise above the muck. Children laugh, though, in their strange way. They dare each other to run close to the moat, pinching their noses, shrieking with mock horror. One boy hurls a stone onto the melting ice, watching it crack and sink. He howls with glee while his mother drags him back, furious. To them, it's grotesque entertainment, proof that winter's boredom has ended. They don't yet understand the danger rising in the air, and danger there is. By dusk, coughs echo in the hall. A page leans pale against a wall, muttering about stomach cramps. Servants whisper that the moat has poisoned him. Rumours spread quickly. Disease rides the thaw. Fear returns, sharper than the cold ever was. The castle braces itself for another kind of siege, not from armies, but from illness. You retreat inside, back to your chamber, and feel the dampness creeping everywhere. The straw on the floor squelches faintly when pressed. The rushes smell of mildew. The once refreshing cold has given way to clammy discomfort. Your blanket feels heavy, almost wet. The thaw is here, and it will not be gentle. Yet life goes on. The kitchen's roar with activity, the chapel bells ring, and the Lord still holds court. The castle persists because it must. People laugh, work, and complain as they always do. The thaw doesn't end them, it simply reminds them of their fragility, of the price of living together in stone walls without plumbing. and hears one final joke whispered by a jester, who knows the value of laughter in foul times. Winter hides our shame in ice, but spring lets it sing again. The hall erupts in chuckles, even as servants gag outside. Humour, as ever, keeps spirits alive. So as you settle under your blankets tonight, the castle exhaling damp air around you, you realise the cycle is complete. Winter's chill has faded, but its waste remains, melting into a reminder that comfort was never permanent. The castle may stand tall, its banners snapping proudly, but beneath, in the moat and shafts, the truth of daily life lingers. Filth endures, just as surely as stone does, and with that image, the thawing moat, the rising stench, the servants scraping endlessly, you let your eyes close. The story has wound itself through draughts and pots, through superstition and feasts, through frozen rivers and thawing curses. You have sat where nobles sat, shivered where servants shivered, and gagged where children laughed. Now it's time to let go of the muck and drift into cleaner dreams. The torches are burning low now, their glow softer, steadier, as though the castle itself has decided to rest. The wind outside has lost its edge, sighing gently across the battlements instead of howling. You sink deeper into the blankets of your imagination, wool scratching lightly against your skin, and feel your body surrender to warmth at last. All around you, the castle settles. The creak of timbers is slow and rhythmic, like an old house breathing in its sleep. The rushes on the floor no longer crunch under hurried boots, they lie quiet, undisturbed. The guardrobe shafts whisper faintly, but the sound is less a shriek now, and more a lullaby of moving air, steady and predictable. Even the moat, grotesque though it is, gurgles like a distant brook, softened by distance and fatigue. You remind yourself that for all its discomforts, this world was lived in, endured, laughed at, and carried forward by countless people. They found ways to cope, to joke, to believe, and so can you. The draughts, the smells, the frozen ridges of filth, they are part of history's texture, and tonight they are nothing more than stories carried on a quiet wind. Let your breath slow. Inhale gently, as though you too are breathing in lavender sprigs hung against cold stone. Exhale, releasing the last of the discomfort. Your body grows heavier, your mind lighter. The sounds of the castle fade, the moat drifts further away, and the cold becomes nothing more than a crisp memory. Sleep comes softly, like fresh rushes laid on a floor, like spring light on melting ice. Let it cover you now, steady and calm.